afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on restructured teacher pay systems. Pardon me while I get to the right slide. As was already mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Greniger, and today I'll be facilitating your webinar. With me today is our featured presenter, Dan Goldhaber. I'll be doing a more formal introduction in just a moment. Dan is the director of the Center for Education Data and Research. He is a professor of interdisciplinary arts and sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. He does a lot of work focused on educational productivity and reform in K-12 systems, focusing on the broad array of human capital policies that influence the composition, distribution, and quality of teachers in the workforce, and focuses a lot on the connections between students' K-12 experiences and post-secondary outcomes. Dan has published on several topics, including the stability of value-added measures of teachers, the effects of teacher qualifications and quality on student achievement, and the impact of teacher pay structure and licensure on the teacher labor market. Before I hand it over to Dan, I'd like to find a little bit about who's joining us today. You'll see a poll asking the role that best fits the role that you serve. And we'd also like to know, of those attending today, who attended the original webinar on this same topic last year. Great, so it looks like we have a nice range of participants today, leaning towards researchers and policy folks. I think that everyone will get something out of today's talk, but there's a good deal of policy around this issue, and Dan will certainly pique your interest on this topic. And looks like several of you have not attended the prior presentation, so this will be an abbreviated version, the review at the beginning, but feel free to download in the resources box the full presentation from 2013. And we're going to use today's session to really open up for questions and hear from you about your experience with this topic thus far. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Dan Goldhaber.
Familiar name, so for those of you who I know, it's nice to talk to you, so to speak. And as Elizabeth mentioned, this is kind of a follow-up to the presentation that I did a year ago or so. So for those that were on that presentation, this is going to be a little bit of repeat, but I hopefully will have some new things to add, and there's more room for discussion here. So as Elizabeth mentioned, this presentation is entitled Restructured Teacher Pay Systems. And I want to begin by just giving you a little bit of background on what research has to say about teacher quality and teacher effectiveness. And I think that, you know, for anybody who is been following education reform and educational issues, you can tell that there's quite a lot of discussion about teachers today, because the research is pretty definitive in showing that amongst the things that school systems have control over, and so there's a lot that they obviously do not, but amongst things that they have control over, teacher effectiveness looks like the most important factor in influencing student outcomes. And much of what we know when it comes to influencing student outcomes is about student test scores, but there's actually new research that suggests that the effects that teachers have on students are much broader than just test score effects, but affect, later life outcomes such as the probability of graduating from high school, the probability of going on to college, labor market participation and earnings. So things that I would argue are much more of much more greater significance, and people would broadly agree really matter. I personally think that test scores are a very important determinant of what a very important outcome what schools do, but there's a lot of debate over how much we ought to be valuing test scores versus other kinds of measures. So just to kind of give you a framework for what the effect of teachers means in more concrete terms, it looks like a teacher that moves from, say, the middle of the performance distribution, so sort of an average quality teacher, to a teacher who is a standard deviation better than average, or at the 84th percentile. Difference is roughly equivalent to lowering sizes to 10 or 13 students. So quite a large size in class size reduction, very expensive change.
Dan, can you hear me?
It also looks like that difference is far bigger than the average difference that we typically see between a totally novice teacher and, say, a teacher with 5 or 10 years of teaching experience. And I think the reason that folks are here today and why there's a lot of interest in pay systems looks like the kinds of teacher credentials that we typically use for high stakes decisions, whether or not you are eligible to participate these studies exist between teachers. So given that, there's quite a lot of interest in reforming teacher pay to try and connect it more to the things about teachers that may really matter. So that's kind of the sort of the theoretical background. Okay, can you hang on one second? Can you call in on the phone? So apparently you all may not be able to hear my audio that well. So I'm going to call in on the phone, but keep talking Dan, in the interim. One of the... Yeah, go ahead.
Dan, I was just going to say that we can just take a second for you to call in if I think that would be better for participants because everyone's having a hard time hearing you.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me better now?
We sure can.
Terrific. So did folks get the sort of the gist of what I was saying earlier?
I think it was a little choppy from, I'm going to actually scroll back for you because I want to make sure people get what you said on the initial slide. If you want to just give a quick overview of this slide 7 again, I think people would appreciate that.
Sure. So I will just go over this really quickly. There's just a boatload of research that suggests that in looking at student achievement, that amongst the factors over which schools have direct control, that teacher quality has kind of the largest impact. So these are studies that, for instance, look at changes in teacher effectiveness versus other kinds of educational interventions, like reducing class sizes or different kinds of whole school reforms. And the studies, really reach the same conclusion that if you can if you can get a high-quality teacher, that seems to give you much more of a bang for your educational buck in terms of student performance than other kinds of schooling interventions. And then on the slide, I just mentioned that one particular, example of the specific example of the effect suggests that having the difference between teachers at the middle of the performance distribution versus one who is a standard deviation better or at the 84th percentile of the performance distribution is roughly equivalent to lowering class sizes by 10 to 13 students. So quite a large, change in class size. And then sort of the way into the discussion of teacher pay is that we typically pay teachers in this country based on their degree and experience level, and those qualifications are only very weakly related to teacher quality. It looks like teachers become more effective during the early part of their career, so the first 5 to 8 years of performance, first 5 to 8 years of experience. But then the relationship between teacher experience and teacher performance tends to level out beyond that. And there's not a very strong relationship between having a master's degree and teacher performance in general. There are some exceptions that I can talk about, but in general that's the case. So the bottom line is that experience and degree level are pretty weakly correlated with student achievement. And the other thing that I mentioned, which may have been difficult to hear, is that in general, when I talk about student achievement, I'm talking about achievement on standardized tests. And that's one of the primary ways that it's measured, but there's some new and pretty compelling evidence that changes in teacher quality or teacher effectiveness affect not only performance on standardized tests, but also impact a lot of later life outcomes that I think most people would consider to be important. The probability of high school graduation, the probability of going on to college, labor market earnings. And I will just let you know that that's a study by Raj Chetty and some colleagues that is forthcoming in the American Economic Review if you want to take a look at it. So again, one reason why people are interested in changing teacher pay is that the credentials that are used to reward salaries are generally not well connected to these measures of teacher productivity. But the other reason is that the single salary schedule is pretty out of step with the broader labor market. So in the broader labor market, for instance, individuals tend to be rewarded for the area in which they get their degree. So for instance, STEM majors science, technology, engineering, and math majors tend to earn more than non-STEM majors. And that's generally not true in education. It's also the case that in education there's typically not a big difference in pay for teachers that might be serving in hard-to-staff schools, that may be in more dangerous neighborhoods or may have students that are less ready to learn when they show up. And so it's not surprising that there are certain schools and certain subjects where it's just sort of chronically hard to recruit and retain teachers. So the focus here is primarily on pay for performance, but I think that there are some broader reasons why one might want to think about changing the single salary schedule. So pay for performance or merit pay, it means different things to different people. But generally, the idea is that you're rewarding people for some measure of their performance. Oftentimes it is student gains on standardized tests. That's definitely what a lot of the research literature that I'm going to describe is about. Does it look like if you explicitly connect a teacher's pay to the kinds of learning gains that their students seem to achieve on these standardized tests, that gives them an incentive to work harder or work smarter, and given that incentive, that their students do better. So that's the focus of a lot of the research studies that are on pay for performance. There's actually quite a lot of evidence on pay for performance. Pay for performance is not really new, but most of the high-quality studies in the United States are relatively new. So when you do kind of a broad review of the literature on pay for performance, I think it's appropriate to characterize it as pretty mixed. When you look at pay for performance in other countries, there tends to be positive effects, but the context that sort of the other country educational context is often quite different. So for instance, there's a very convincing study from India that shows that pay for performance has sizable effects. But in India, one of the things that one of the difficulties is actually just getting teachers to show up on a regular basis. And so one of the mechanisms through which pay for performance seems to affect student achievement in India is by having more regular teacher attendance, and it's not surprising that students learn more when their teachers are actually there. The evidence in the United States, when it comes to the really high quality experimental evidence, suggests relatively little effect of pay for performance. And when I say experiment, I'm thinking about a case where it's not just that somebody's trying out pay for performance, but it's the design of the study is quite scientific in the sense that there's an experimental group that is getting the treatment, pay for performance, and a control group that is not getting the treatment, and the comparison is between the experimental group and the treatment group. The non-experimental studies in the United States are also a bit mixed. There's one new study that I think is quite convincing, and I'm just going to throw out the name of the authors. It's by Tom D. and Jim Wyckoff, and it looks at pay for performance in Washington, D.C. under the Washington impact system. And performance is judged in a broader way than just on student test scores. And they find that it looks like the system is working as intended in that teachers that are eligible to receive additional bonuses because they did well in one period, and if they do well in another, they get a big increment on their pay, that they tend to perform better in that subsequent period. There's also a pretty interesting experiment where teachers are given a bonus ahead of time and told that if their students perform well, that they get to keep the bonus, but if their students don't perform well, the bonus is taken away, and that also shows effects on student achievement. It's hard to think about how that kind of a system would be implemented, but I think it's important. It's an important study because it shows that you can change the performance of teachers that are in service, and there's a lot of debate about that. Now, one thing about most of these studies is that they are generally designed only to detect short-run impacts on student achievement. So it's possible that some of the reasons that we don't see, bigger effects in general on the experimental studies is that the participants know that it's an experiment, and or that the way that pay for performance may impact student achievement and teacher effectiveness is more of a sort of a long-term proposition, that you're eligible for pay incentives, and you therefore go out and get different kinds of professional development, or you go to seek help from the teachers that seem to be doing well, and you learn. And the studies, which generally run from 2 to 3 years, they're not really designed to pick up those kinds of longer-term effects. But there are other reasons why pay for performance may not work well in education. Education is a complex endeavor. It's hard to measure what seems to make teachers effective or ineffective, and there's a high degree of collaboration that is at least desired in schools. And so in those kind of environments, you tend to see less pay for performance in the private sector because it's thought that those kind of environments are not always conducive to pay for performance. Also, there are all kinds of design issues, and maybe we can get into some of those in the question and answers. Finally, there's kind of a famous idea from Donald Campbell, who I think was either a psychologist or sociologist, I can't remember off the top of my head, but he basically suggested that when you use a particular indicator to kind of judge a process, so for instance, you say that we're going to base your pay on student achievement, then that is going to lead to a perversion of the process. And that applies to a lot of different sort of aspects of accountability and education, but in the case of teacher pay, one worries that a type of perversion would be, teachers cheating on tests to make their students look like they did better than they did in order to get a bonus. And so I think that, when educators are thinking about reforms, that you need to be kind of aware of Campbell's law to try and guard against it, because it's something that one would be wary about given the test scandals that we've seen play out in places like Georgia. Right. Okay, so I mentioned that it may be too early to sort of write off pay for performance, and one reason is that the studies are not designed to affect short-term gains. I mentioned this D. and Wyckoff paper on impact in Washington, D.C. But the other thing that is worth considering is that one of the mechanisms through which people think that pay for performance may affect the quality of a workforce is through what's known as workforce sorting, that people sort in and out of a workforce. So you're more likely to be attracted into a workforce if you think that you are going to be rewarded for doing well. And so you might think that a pay-for-performance system would attract different people into the teaching profession. And certainly you're more likely to leave a workforce if you're not being well rewarded. So to the degree that pay-for-performance is rewarding things that we care about, then you would expect that the teachers who are not doing very well on those indicators that we care about would be more likely to leave the workforce. So there are sort of workforce sorting mechanisms that, again, would take a lot longer to detect than we typically would have in sort of short-term studies on student achievement on tests. I mentioned some of the other reasons why we might want to think about teacher pay reforms, and I think actually there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to differential pay by subject or differential pay by the degree of difficulty of the teaching assignment. And there's some evidence that suggests that incentives to, say, encourage teachers to stay in disadvantaged schools, that works. And so I think that those are other really important things for people to keep in the back of their mind when they're thinking about pay reform, because it's pay for performance is sort of the sexy kind of reform, but pay reform is much broader than that, and it may be the case that there are lots of kinds of pay reform that would work to better student achievement in ways that are not necessarily connected to the performance element of it. So I think I'm going to transition back to Elizabeth and do another poll.
Yes, thanks, Dan. We're going to be opening up this multiple choice poll in just a moment, but I think before we do that, there was a little bit of activity in the parking lot, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the questions because they pertain to some of the slides you were just sharing, and I want to make sure we capture that before we move along.
Okay, that sounds great.
Yeah, so Will was asking, this refers back, I think, to one of the earlier slides, if you could explain a little bit more about what it means when you say teacher is one standard deviation better than the mean. He's curious about that and what the units are.
So the reason statisticians, that's a great question, Will, and the reason that statisticians measure things in standard deviations is it really gets to the heart of the question, and it's about units. So for instance, a 10-point gain on the Iowa test of basic skills is not equivalent to a 10-point gain on the SAT. So what statisticians try and do is they put things in standard deviation terms to try and put everybody on this sort of on the same scale and measure where do students, for instance, fall relative to their peers and where do teachers fall relative to their peers. So when I'm talking about, the standard deviation change, I'm talking about it in terms of a typical sort of bell curve. And you could think about, a standard deviation difference between someone who is of median height. And I don't know anything about height other than I personally am a little bit on the short side, but the median height might be 5'8", and a standard deviation shorter could be someone who is 5'4". And so a standard deviation is about 30 from the difference between someone who's at the middle and someone who's a standard deviation below the middle of the distribution is about 34 percentile points. So one standard deviation below the middle is the 16th percentile, and the example that I used was a standard deviation above the middle, which is the 84th percentile. So again, it's the difference between a teacher who is kind of middle of the road of effectiveness and a teacher, if we were to rank all of the teachers and sort of line them up based on their effectiveness, who would be more effective than 84% of the other teachers that they're being compared to.
That's helpful, Dan. Hopefully Will thinks it's helpful. I see he's typing, so maybe he's going to let us know if he has any follow-up questions. He's asking what's being measured.
Oh, so this measure is it's value added, and so it's the measure of teachers based on the achievement of their students. And so, we can talk more about value added, but the idea of value added is that it's a statistical measure of teacher contributions to student learning gains on standardized tests.
Great. And another follow-up question, Florentina was asking about whether it was a longitudinal study. I'm not really sure which one she was addressing, but I think after she asked that question, I think you did touch on that, but I don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
So I believe it's the case that most of the studies that I mentioned are longitudinal, at least in the sense that they are measuring learning gains at two different points. There are some of the studies that are the experiments where you don't necessarily, one of the arguments for having a longitudinal study is you want to account for where students began their achievement. So you're measuring the distance that they travel, because we probably wouldn't want to infer something about the quality of instruction if we just knew that the average performance of students was at the 84th percentile in one classroom versus the 42nd percentile in another classroom, because we could be talking about entirely different kinds of classrooms. One could be the remedial class, and one could be the advanced class. And so typically these studies are looking at how do students move in the distribution when they have different kinds of teachers. The exception in some cases is with experiments where the study is designed in such a way to create treatment and control groups that look pretty comparable based on both observable and unobserved dimensions.
Great. And the one last question related to the studies you were discussing, this should be hopefully a simple one. Michael was asking in reference to the study in India. He's saying, are you talking about dew flow? And I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but maybe you do.
No, I'm not. I am talking about a study by two authors whose last names are quite difficult for me to pronounce, and I'm going to kind of page through because I believe, if you contact me, I can give you the the authors' names, but it's a study by I can tell you one author is Kartik, and I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, but he is at UC San Diego, I believe. So I can give you the details.
Great, that'll be helpful. So we will make sure people get that information either by the end of the webinar or as a follow-up. So let's move now. There's still a few more comments, but I'm going to hold some of those for the next part of our discussion. We're going to put up a poll, a multiple choice question. We're really curious to find out from folks on the line what's happening in your schools and districts in terms of the payment structure for teachers. So you'll see a couple of options and select the one that best fits. And if you feel that you want to expand on what's occurring in your district, use the parking lot to tell us a little bit more about your system. We're particularly interested in finding out if you have a career ladder system or a bonus system, what does that entail? So we can see where there's some commonalities and maybe where there's some differences. So Dan, as you see people responding, it looks like almost half of the folks have a single salary system. How does that resonate with what you've seen out in the field?
So I don't think that we know, 2014, what percentage of districts in the United States are using the single salary schedule. But studies, from earlier years suggest that it's well over 90% typically use the single salary schedule. Now that is changing really rapidly because of the federal teacher incentive fund and Race to the Top initiatives, and to some extent perhaps because of the NCLB waivers. So it wouldn't surprise me if today we were below 90% using single salary schedule, but these percentages are quite different, I would guess, than what we would see nationally, and interesting.
Definitely interesting. And, folks are probably thinking about this a little bit, and I see Julia's telling us about she's in a charter school, and so they have a little bit more autonomy. I would venture to say that the difference between public and charter situations may, impact. So I don't know where people are all coming from, but that may have an influence with some of the responses here.
Yeah, I think charters are slightly more likely to use pay for performance, although charters in New Orleans is a pretty unique case, and charters in New Orleans I think are different than charter schools nationally. Interestingly, this goes back again, a decade or so, but it doesn't look like there's as much use of pay for performance in private schools as one might guess. They're more likely to use pay for performance, but my recollection is that, instead of about, 3 or 4% of schools, which is what you see in the public sector using pay for performance, you see it's 10% in private schools. So it's not they're not diametrically different.
Great. Well, let's move on a little bit because we want to make sure we have enough time for everyone to really get engaged in the discussion. Our next slide, we're really going to open it up a little bit more to get people's perspectives on this topic of the single salary schedule. And we're interested in finding out for you all as participants, do you think it makes sense? And if not, and a good half of you are not using the single salary schedule or using some other form of performance pay, what do you see as roadblocks to changing the system? So if you believe that the single salary schedule is not the way to go, how do you see the system changing? And Dan, while we have people responding to that, we had a few questions that came in the registration, and maybe it will be a great time to touch on those.
Yep.
Terrific. So one of the questions was, is there any evidence that eliminating pay raises for master's degrees and other academic milestones has a long-term effect on highly talented teacher pools? And my read on this question, this part of the question, is that it's about who is opting to pursue a career in teaching, and the short answer is no. There's not much evidence, and there's not much evidence because it probably takes quite a while before we could actually see how changes in salary structure would affect the kind of people who would be opting into teaching, because you don't make that decision on the fly, and so we want to look to see how different parts of the teacher pipeline are changing. For instance, who is getting an education degree from traditional teacher training programs. I do want to say, though, in theory, and this would be an important point, that I personally believe it makes sense to restructure the master, at the very least, restructure the master's pay premium, given the evidence connecting it to teacher performance. But I don't agree that you can just eliminate the master's pay premium and do nothing else, and save money, and expect that it wouldn't negatively affect the quality of the teacher workforce. Because even though that form of salary bump is not strongly connected to teacher performance, it is one of the ways that teachers get a raise. So I personally think that when it comes to reforming the master's pay premium, that it makes sense to think about using that money differently, not just simply eliminating it. So there was a second part to the question, which is, does it have an effect on student achievement? Does eliminating the master's pay premium have an effect on student achievement? Here, I guess I would say look at some of the studies that focus on pay reform, and so the answer is it's mixed. So there are some districts that have done away with the single salary schedule or the master's pay premium, and there are studies that look at the implications. Now, there are lots of things that are happening. It's not just eliminating the master's pay premium. These are districts that may be reforming the kind of feedback that teachers get about performance. They may be changing other aspects of the salary schedule. So you wouldn't want to interpret the findings of the study as simply being about the master's pay premium, but as a for instance, I did some work with Joe Walsh looking at the system in Denver, and we found that it looked like there were student performance gains in Denver that may have been connected to the ProComp, which is the pay reform in Denver, but it was hard to pin it down to being just about the change in salary structure alone, because Denver was doing a lot of different things, and the gains that we saw for students accrued to teachers that were in the reformed salary system, ProComp, and teachers that had opted not to join the reformed salary system. And then the other study I'd point to is this Dee and Wyckoff study in Washington, based on Washington, D.C., because Washington has really quite radically changed the way that teachers are evaluated and paid.
Thanks, Dan. That's given folks a lot of time to respond to the questions, and I think one of the general themes I see here is that people are kind of mixed on how they feel about the single salary schedule, whether it makes sense. I think there's a lot of complexity to this issue, and that's what people are pointing out. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the themes that we're seeing here. People are raising the issue that funding is a challenge with changing the single salary schedule, and also this issue of how are we evaluating teacher effectiveness, and so that big question still remains is, the single salary schedule may prevail because of the fact that the complexity with changing it is too great to really overcome at this point. But I'll let you speak a little bit on what you see here and the comments people are making.
Yeah, so I guess I'd make 2 or 3 overarching comments. One, people tend to think about pay for performance and salary changes as connected, solely to student achievement on standardized tests. But Campbell's law applies to, sort of any measure that would be used. So I think the kind of the bottom line is that if you're going to think about changing the salary schedule and again, connect salaries to performance, that you want to think really, really hard about how you are judging performance. And I think, at least theoretically, there are some compelling points, some compelling reasons why you wouldn't want to judge performance based on sort of any single measure like student achievement on tests, but a compendium of measures. The second overarching point I would make is, well, actually, I'm going to back up for a second. Connected to that idea, you really want other kinds of systems, and I'm a little bit stepping on my lead here because I think this comes up in later slides, but you really want other kinds of systems that are going to change along with the pay system. I think you really need human capital management systems that ensure that your measures of performance are good. So the sort of the place to start with any reform is just with teacher evaluation. Regardless of how the evaluations are going to be used. I would argue you really want a good teacher evaluation system for a whole host of school reforms, everything from informing professional development and making decisions about tenure to connecting teacher performance to pay. And also the kind of feedback systems that determine what information teachers are getting about their performance and whether it informs the kind of the kind of professional development they get, for instance. The second thing that I would say is that so there's what's the outcome? What are the other systems that are connected to pay? And then thinking more broadly about pay reform, and this just echoes what I was saying earlier, that there are reasons why you might want to reform pay that are not directly connected to performance, and so some of the comments deal with the complexity of pay for performance. And I certainly understand that it's more administratively complex to administer a pay for performance system, but there are some sort of intermediate steps that, in terms of pay reform, that may not be all that complex, but might deal with some of the issues that we see with the teacher labor market. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that it's harder to recruit and retain teachers in certain kinds of schools. Well, it's probably not all that administratively complex to say that teachers teaching in those schools simply get an add-on to their salary. And as I mentioned, there's evidence to suggest that that kind of an add-on has an impact on teacher effectiveness. I also think that we're learning a lot from the experiments that are taking place with pay reform today. And so what might be seen as terribly complex today may not be seen as so complex, as we go forward.
This is great. I see there's quite a lot of activity, and I know people are eager to share their ideas. We're coming up on our hour, so I want to let Dan get through a few more slides, and we have a few more questions for you all in the remaining minutes. So, Dan, I know you want to share a little bit about some general strategies for those different challenges that folks were bringing up.
Yeah, I mean, this relates to actually just the discussion we were just having. So I think that it's really important to have a clear theory of action as to why you're changing your pay system. So is it about equity issues and trying to get high quality teachers into disadvantaged schools? Is it about pay? Is it about the sort of the general labor market trends and the fact that it's hard to recruit teachers in certain subjects. So getting sort of a clear idea about what the purpose is of reforming teacher pay system is a good place to start. And then, as I mentioned, my read on the literature is that if you change pay alone, that the effects tend to be small to non-existent. So you really need to change other systems consistent with the pay system. And this a little bit speaks to the questions about administrative complexity. But I think for instance, on pay for performance, you really want to make sure that you're measuring performance well. So sort of the performance management systems need to be changed. You want to make sure that you're guarding against Campbell's Law, so that you've got sort of auditing systems in place to make sure that teachers aren't just, that they aren't cheating, that they aren't teaching to the test in bad ways if your system is based on tests, or that they're just not in a system that might be based on classroom observations, just practice doing certain things when they know that someone's watching them. So again, people are used to thinking about pay reform as it relates to student achievement on tests, but these issues that you need to think about are broader, and it doesn't matter how you measure teacher performance. You really want to think about why are you doing it, and what are the systems that you have in place to support it. And then the other thing is that I would not think of any kind of reform as sort of the end point, but that we're going to learn from reform. And so that we need to think about how we would judge and evaluate whether the reform is successful, and so that whether it's done what is intended, or if maybe it needs to be tweaked or entirely rethought. So those are some of the thoughts about pay reform.
Great. What I think we're going to do is I'm going to skip over this question for just a moment, and we'll come back to it, and we'll wrap up with this and one other final question. But I want to give you an opportunity to just share this last slide on success before we open it back up again.
And you know what? I actually think, Elizabeth, that I covered most of these thoughts, so we could probably just skip over this one.
Perfect. That's great. So we're going to ask folks to share. We just talked in the last poll about what roadblocks you see, but now we want to hear and end on a positive note and have you share some of your successes. I think Dan can respond to what he's seeing happening out there, but also I think you'll all gather a lot of great ideas from seeing what's happening across the states and the participants who are on the line today. So you'll see a poll. What successes have you had with restructuring teacher pay or various pay initiatives in your schools and districts? And while you're answering that, there's some commentary and questions about the difference between incentive pay and pay for performance. Do you want to touch on that a little bit, Dan, while folks are responding?
So, incentive pay I think of as being much broader, that you could think of incentives for all kinds of, all kinds of behaviors that you're trying to elicit. So a good example of incentive pay would be, for instance, pay to induce, math and science teachers to stay in a school or district. Or a bonus to get teachers to stay in a difficult to staff school. Those would be examples of incentive pay. Pay for performance is a particular kind of incentive that is connected to the idea of trying to get teachers to teach differently, perhaps work harder, and incent a particular outcome. And again, that outcome might be certain teacher practices, if you were judging them based on what you observed in the classroom, or it might be student test scores. I want to actually just, while there's a little pause here, say something about a question that came up earlier, which is just about the money issue. Do we have enough money to do anything? And ultimately, this is a judgment call. my take on the master's pay premium is that there's so much money that's going into it, and that it looks, it just doesn't look like it's a money that is, it doesn't look like a very effective way to spend your educational dollar, and that the studies on this are so overwhelming. They go back, 20 years, and the findings are really pretty consistent, that even in the absence of an inflow of additional money, that there are ways that you could change teacher pay to spend the master's pay premium better. I also would say that I think that teachers, there's an implicit contract when teachers start in a district. So I think that politically it's quite hard to do what I've just said if you're gonna say all teachers are in the new system. So I think that having an opt-in for teachers that are incumbent to the system makes sense, and that requiring a switch is probably a political non-starter. And then the other thing that I would say is that the situation in Denver, and again I'd reference all the literature on pro-comp, is pretty interesting because Denver for years and years and years tried to increase teacher pay and couldn't do it until they decided to change their pay system and went to the voters and said, would you pay this additional levy if the pay system is going to change? And it changed in a lot of ways. Pay for performance is just one of them. And voters were willing to ante up tens of millions of dollars of additional money for teacher raises if they came in a particular form. So I think that sometimes people think that the direction of causality is only in one way, that we need additional pay, we need additional resources to change the pay system, but sometimes changing the pay system could lead to additional resources. That's certainly the case for federal grants like the Teacher Incentive Fund.
And I think that's a great segue because at least a few folks have been mentioning in the response to this successes question, talking about race to the top, talking about the TIF programs, and some of those federal incentives that will assist districts in supporting their teacher pay initiatives. So, Dan, does anything jump out at you here with respect to the comments people are making and what you have seen in your research?
Well, I guess I just harken back a little bit to what I was saying about the other systems, that you just don't want to think about changing pay alone. I think that there are places, and I just want to be really clear, this is my impression as opposed to drawing on particular empirical studies. My impression is that there are places in the country that are changing their pay system in order to make themselves eligible for these additional resources, and that if that kind of impetus for reform, we're going to go after the new money, doesn't lead to the kinds of changes that are really ultimately going to affect students. That the arguments for changing, there are, I believe, some compelling arguments for changing the teacher pay system, but you really want to start from that place, that the pay system doesn't perhaps make a lot of sense. We're going to reform it. And, oh, by the way, there are some resources that will help us do that, as opposed to, wow, there are some resources out there that we can grab if we reform the system. And that if you start from that place, you're not likely to do the other things that are really going to be necessary to make teacher pay reform successful.
Well, and I think that point really aligns with a few of the comments, like what Havala is saying about incentivizing teachers to do things that will improve their practice, and I think someone else mentioned something similar, that starting from that point of improving practice and then letting the system evolve out of that is what maybe some systems are focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
So we just have a few minutes before we wrap up. I'm going to move us right along, and I want to make sure that we have just a few minutes for any follow-up questions. So we're going to actually blend these two next slides. You'll see one poll that comes up that asks, what action steps you may plan to take as a result of what you heard in today's webinar. We hope you will do something with the information you've heard and continue the conversation in your district or school or the place where you're working with educators. And then I'll also put up the Q&A box, so if there are any final questions for Dan, you can put those up now as well. And Dan, over in the parking lot, we have a few questions that have been rolling in. Laura's interested in what
are the compelling reasons?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the compelling reason to me to change to pay for performance is that you ultimately want a pay system that is aligned with your broader objectives. You know, that's what we see that in the private sector, and I don't mean that in terms of you know, sort of short-term bonuses for selling lots of houses. I mean that there is in the private sector broadly, there's a connection between your performance on the job and the likelihood that you are going to advance, and when you advance, that you're going to get additional compensation for that advancement. But again, I would say that pay for performance is not where I personally would start if I were thinking about changing the teacher pay. I would start with trying to address the shortages that we see in certain subjects, you know, the difficulty of recruitment and retention, and the fact that there are real inequities in the distribution of teachers across schools, and that those inequities look to be, you know, certainly related to the fact that teachers tend to be paid the same regardless of the difficulty of the assignment. So I think that there are some really compelling reasons to change the single salary schedule that speak to the broader labor market, and that some of those relate to pay for performance. And I guess lastly, I would say some of the newest empirical evidence, and again, I'm thinking about the D. and Wyckoff paper, suggests that if you're smart and you do a lot of things right, not just changing pay, then it can have impacts on student achievement. And you know, ultimately, that's why I suspect everybody's on the webinars, because they're thinking about, well, what can we do to affect student achievement. I'll just say there's a question here on national board certification, and in the time we have left, all I can say is that there's a fair amount of research on national board certification. I've done some of it, and my work from North Carolina suggests that board certified teachers tend to be more effective than non-board certified teachers. But again, there's a lot of overlap in the distribution. So knowing something about who the individual is more informative than knowing that they hold or don't hold the national, you know, the NBPTS credential.
Thanks for getting to that question, Dan. Our hour is up, and I know it goes by much too quickly. Folks have had a lot of great commentary and questions. We will continue this conversation online for folks who are interested. If you've attended one of our prior webinars, you'll see that we have an online forum. And I'm trying to get you to the right slide so you can see that. You can reach our forum at therelmidatlantic.org/forum, and that is a place where you can continue to ask questions of one another and kind of pick one another's brains around this topic and all of our topics. If you do have questions for either Dan or I, you can be in touch with us, me more so on the general series that we're running here. And if you have specific questions for Dan, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them on the topic of pay for performance. And we hope you'll come back for some of our upcoming webinars. Next month we'll be having our Ask an Expert online chat on the teacher's role in quality classroom interactions with Drew Jitomer. And then we have also in June one of our teacher effectiveness webinars on formative assessment and instructional practice. We do hope you'll join us for those events. And we really value your feedback, so we hope that you'll take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation and provide your input on today's webinar and the series in general. And at this time, I'd like to take an opportunity to give Dan a virtual round of applause, thanking him for his time today and the wonderful information he shared on restructured teacher pay systems.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure being here.
And we hope you all have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.